Ask Tell number 12. I'm Adam Kadri. So the idea behind this series was for me to get caught up on the world of interactive fiction. I started the show in 2015, and in those first few episodes, we covered games from 2002. As I record this, it's now 2023, and we are up to the games of 2006. So I did some calculations, and at this rate, I should be caught up by 1989. The problem is that that's not how time works. Now, to a certain extent, this is deceiving, because we actually reached 2006 in the last episode, which came out in 2018. Then I went into public education for a few years and had basically no time to do anything that wasn't related to school. When I finally moved on and had some time to work on my own projects, I took this one out of mothballs, but then I had some problems. Back in 2009, I had my first attack of dental root resorption, which is when, for reasons that are currently not well understood, a tooth goes autoimmune and starts eating itself from the inside. I had a second attack in 2018. Both of those times, the teeth could be saved. This time around, I wasn't so lucky. I had to have some major reconstruction, which took 11 months and seems to have permanently affected my speech. I've been told that it isn't noticeable, but it's noticeable to me. I waited a little bit to give it time to get better, but I think this is probably as good as it's going to get. So away we go. First up, we have the Elysium Enigma by Eric Eve. I'd hoped to avoid having to play any more Eric Eve games because his game Square Circle, which we covered back in episode number 6, was the single worst game to have appeared on this show, at least up to this point. But I couldn't in good conscience skip this one because it did win the Zizzy Award for the best game of 2006. And calling in from Western Australia to discuss it with me is longtime contributor Kat Zhang. So before we get to the game, what's been going on with you over the past 5 years or so?
What's been going on in the last 5 years? So I graduated. I graduated during a very bad time to be trying to find a job for nursing graduates. And then, I think a year or two after that, we went into a global pandemic, and now we're in an unprecedented nursing shortage / crisis. And now suddenly I'm really in demand. So that's pretty bizarre. Going from go away, we don't want you, to no, please come here, we'll pay you, in the space of a few short months.
Yeah, for ages I've been hearing that here in California we have a teacher shortage, or are about to have one. And to try to help out, I actually went through a credentialing program, put in years at a high school to clear my credential, got tons of positive feedback from students and parents and colleagues, and when it came time for tenure, it was still, go away, we don't want you. And it's like, all right, really? Then fine. I'll go back to private tutoring, where I get to make my own schedule and make a much higher hourly wage. But if you're turning people away, I guess you can't be too worried about a teacher shortage.
Yeah, I know. That's kind of the same thing. For the last 10 or 20 years, they've kept saying, oh, there's going to be a nursing shortage, there's going to be a nurse shortage. And it's never really panned out. We had the global financial crisis, and I think that caused a lot of nurses to not retire. So, the shortage, basically, it never eventuated. And also we were importing a lot of nurses from overseas. And I guess for a while that wasn't possible anymore. But it was very surprising how quickly it became a crisis. Are there actually so many nurses exiting our system each year that if we can't maintain a constant inflow from overseas, that our entire medical system collapses? And it seems that maybe the answer is yes.
Now, my understanding is that Western Australia is well known as a mining state. It produces more than a third of the iron ore in the world.
Yes.
And I've seen a big gang of contestants on my beloved MasterChef Australia get sent to a mine in Western Australia to run the kitchen. They were responsible for every meal for 24 hours. And I've heard tell that you've spent the lion's share of your nursing career up in the Pilbara visiting those mines. What exactly do they have you doing up there?
Mostly vaccines. First it was COVID vaccines, and then it was flu vaccines. So basically, I don't really know how mining works in other parts of the world. I assume the mines aren't, just conveniently located next to metropolitan centers. But in WA, the mines tend to be really, really far from civilization. I spent a little bit of time in a town called Paraburdoo. I'm just looking it up on Google Maps now. It's 1,250 kilometers from Perth by road. So we have this wonderful and absurd waste of resources known as FIFO, which stands for fly in, fly out. You have a workforce that gets flown to work on a rotating basis, basically. Yeah, and then in order to support that work, I also went to provide like COVID vaccines and then flu vaccines for a little while. So basically, I was just contracted by a medical company, and then I got to live the absurd FIFO lifestyle for a couple of months, and I got to experience, the canteen food and the little huts that you live in and all the rest of that. And that was an interesting experience. Some of my clothes are permanently stained with red dust now, as is tradition.
I guess the other big association that I have with the mines of Western Australia is that the login screen on my computer shows that NASA map of the world at night, where all you really see are the lights. And the vast majority of them correspond to cities. But one of the rare exceptions is that when you look at Australia, you'd think that the vast majority of the population lived in the western third of the outback. But those are just the lighting rigs on the mines. They make Sydney and Melbourne look like everyone's using candles.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
And I guess that, to turn to a place that actually does operate on candle power, we should probably get around to talking about the Elysium Enigma.
All right, so in this game, you play as some kind of official of a large space empire, and you visit one of your vassal states. So this is a planet that is something of a galactic backwater. It's got no technology on purpose, and it also doesn't particularly want your space empire interfering in its affairs, but your empire is having some kind of military conflict or increasing tensions with another space alliance. So it seems there might be trouble around the corner, and they've ordered you to just touch down on this planet, say hi, remind them that you exist, and leave. To, remind them that I know that you really don't care about the space empire, but the space empire is here if you need our services, and then just get out of there.
Yeah, as I recall, the initial mission is very minimal. You're just supposed to go to the government building and raise the flag and say hello to some locals. And there is an ending. It was the first ending I reached, in which you just do the tasks you were assigned and go home. And the game ends saying you haven't achieved much.
Which is a fair assessment.
Yeah, but I've talked in the past about how it's not the best interactivity to have the freedom to experience a worse story. Not a story in which worse things happen, but just a story of lower quality. That doesn't seem like the wisest authorial choice. But, speaking of quality, what did you actually think of this game?
I think it definitely wasn't the worst game I've ever played. I would say that I enjoyed it overall. I enjoyed the puzzles for the most part. Maybe you weren't a big fan of the whole, talk to people, find hidden items routine, but I thought having puzzles that were sort of more based around dialogue felt more suitable or more appropriate for the more, realistic setting of the game, as opposed to, I think I described them as like King's Quest type puzzles where you have to get a cat off a box, but the cat doesn't want to move. So you have to find a fishing rod and then assemble a fishing rod, put a hook on the line and catch a fish and then give the fish to the cat to get the cat off a box, which seemed a little bit absurd given that it's pretty easy to just move a cat.
Yes. My girlfriend has 2 cats at present. One of them is pretty ornery, but at the end of the day, it's a cat. If the cat's sitting somewhere you don't want the cat to sit, you can give the cat a little shove, and the puzzle is solved.
It would have been more believable if the author had made it some kind of like native alien species, and it's like, oh, these creatures, they spit acid at you if you displease them, or like this creature weighs 2,000 pounds or something.
Yeah, that's a great point. The fact that you're on an alien planet does make the fix unusually easy. That should have been one of the notes that came up in beta testing. Now, as far as the puzzles are concerned, yeah, this story is partly advanced through dialogue, and I'm totally fine with that. But it's also one of those games in which you have to collect a certain number of objects, and that means that every time you enter a new place, you have to look under every chair and behind every picture frame, and I've just had my fill of all that. And then sometimes it comes down to syntax. Like, there's a bit where you need to find a worm to put on a fishhook, and you happen across an abandoned marketplace that's said to have discarded food scattered about that's only fit for the worms. So maybe you think, aha, okay, well, take a worm. And then it'll say you can't see any such thing. But if you then search the discarded food, it'll say that among the discarded food you see a worm, and then you can pick up the worm. And I guess you could argue that that makes sense, that you have to explicitly search for the worm and see it with your own eyes rather than just assuming that one is there because of the previous description. But I think that even in 2006, high-quality games were expected to be a little bit friendlier than that.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think I ran into that specific problem, but I do know what you mean. And I also felt this. I think you can tell when a game puts a big emphasis on having like the right objects for every situation, and then so I found myself engaging in this obsessive object collection. Like I'd pick up everything that I came across, and then when you go into the market, there's this hungry dog, and if you stay there for too long, the dog will eat some vegetables that are sitting on a trestle table. So I thought, well, no, that won't do, because like I need those vegetables, like not for any reason that I can discern. Well, I suppose like maybe I need to feed this suspicious hungry lady who's accosted me on the outskirts of town. But at that point, I don't actually really know if she's going to be happy with my like raw parsnip or whatever. I just felt that, I needed to collect every object, and the dog wouldn't let me near the vegetables. So not seeing any other way to get them, I shot the dog.
Wow.
So like I didn't even particularly want those items. I was just like, well, the dog definitely can't have them. And then I felt a little bit bad about it.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. It turns out that the game does have more food items than you need. So if you do miss out on the parsnip, because, if there's one thing that a dog loves, it's a parsnip.
It's a parsnip, yes.
If you do lose the parsnip to the dog, it's not a disaster. But these sorts of games have trained me to think, oh no, that's an unrecoverable error. If you need to feed Leela 4 items before she'll talk to you and let you advance in the game, well, that means that there will be exactly 4 edible objects on the entire planet, and I cannot let a dog have one.
Yes.
Well, since we've mentioned Leela, we should probably talk about her properly. Not only did the Elysium Enigma win Best Game of 2006, but Leela also won the Zizzy for Best NPC, NPC being non-player character. So, before we get to my talking points about her, let me ask you, what did you think of Leela as a character?
I thought Leela was quite well programmed. I think she was somewhat convincing as this, she's a free-spirited village girl or something who got in trouble with the elders for questioning the ways of society. But then at the same time, she had shades of the innocent and yet like very busty and attractive wild woman. I'm not really sure how to describe that trope exactly, but like it's very common. And then I suppose in the end it got a little bit subverted in that that wasn't really who she was. That was just who she was pretending to be. But I couldn't help but feel that was still like a little bit eye roll inducing, I suppose. But the thing that I enjoyed about Leela was that I found her sort of suspicious to some degree for the whole game, but not always for the correct reasons. So, like at the start of the game, you're warned not to involve yourself with the locals. But they never really explain why. So as far as I knew, it could have been for any reason at all, including perhaps that the locals are incredibly hostile. So when you first land on the planet and she appears out of nowhere to demand that you go find her some clothes and food, my first thought was that maybe she was trying to swindle me. But then my second thought was like maybe it was some kind of trap that if I did go and get this woman some food and clothes, I might end up somehow getting in trouble with the military or branded a war criminal somehow.
Yeah, you violated the prime directive of non-interference.
Exactly.
Well, I think I agree with all of that. I can see why she won the award. You said she's well programmed, and I think that's a good way to put it. Even if her conversational options aren't as rich as those in a game like Galatea that's 100% devoted to conversation, she's quite possibly the most active NPC I can recall encountering up to this point. Like, instead of just being a resource for you to ask questions of, after a couple of questions, she'll grab control of the conversation and complain, but you haven't told me anything about yourself. And then she'll start questioning you. And I think this is the first game I've run into in which you probably use the word tell more than ask. And the trick is that by telling her things that you, the character, know, but you, the real person playing the game, don't know, all the backstory about the space politics and whatnot comes out. And to have an inquisitive NPC pull this information out of the player character struck me as a really clever way to get that information to the real player.
Yeah, I don't really deal with space politics very well because my brain tends to just shut down whenever there's any sort of lengthy explanation about the political background of a fictional universe. Because, I mean, part of the reason for that is because I don't really have much of a head for politics in real life either. But I try to not let my brain just completely shut itself down every time I encounter a political topic in real life, because I feel that perhaps maybe people should make some level of effort to understand those. But like, I have no such qualms regarding fictional politics. So I happily just go, oh, well, I don't care about any of that. So I do find it quite hard to grasp even things like the scrolling text they have at the beginning of a Star Wars movie, where, the Galactic Federation is doing this, but like over here in the shadows, like this is happening, and I'm just like, I can't. This is pretty hard. Like I'm really struggling with this 2 paragraphs of text. But then when you have all of this being explained in the game in small portions by a person who's basically explaining the space politics to a child, it was a bit easier to actually grasp for me.
Well, I wish the parser could have grasped some of my attempts to advance a conversation. The idea of using tell more than ask is clever, but unfortunately neither one is actually implemented all that well. For instance, there's one point when Leela asks you what a frigate is. So I tried the standard IF phrasing, tell Leela about frigate. And the response was, we can deal with that once you've told me what a frigate is, Leela tells you. So I typed in, tell Leela what a frigate is. And the response was an error message saying that to raise conversational topics, I should just use the word about. And then Leela says, I just asked you what a frigate is. So eventually I had to go to a walkthrough and discovered that the required phrasing was explain frigate. So I typed explain frigate, told her what a frigate is, and then she asked about the crisis going on in the space politics that you were talking about. So since explain frigate had been the previous command, I tried explain crisis, and it didn't work. Suboptimal.
Yes, the limits of parsers and conversation options, I suppose.
But to move on from how well programmed she is or isn't to what you said about her as a character, I agree that she, or at least her persona, is built around a set of familiar tropes. There's the very innocent but sexy, tell me about this Earth thing you call kissing angle.
That's a good way to put it.
Well, yeah, it's sexualization cast as innocence. As in the bit where you return with the food and the sheet to give to her and you find her bathing in the lake or the river or whatever. And she's like, I don't understand. Why do you have all these hang-ups about looking at my naked body? Don't you find me attractive? And then you throw in her opening speech about how she's on the run from an oppressive society because she asked too many questions and dared to speak out. And as you suggest, we've seen this combination before. In a bunch of different places. Clarice from Fahrenheit 451 is probably the most chaste of the ones I'm thinking of. You know, the wide-eyed teenage girl who asked the protagonist a bunch of questions about the nature of their society and opens his eyes to how oppressive their world is. You've got Julia from 1984, who's less innocent, but offers up the fantasy fulfillment of, oh, we're going to strike back against this totalitarian dictatorship by me, the very attractive younger woman, having sex with you, the withered older man. That'll show 'em. And there's Lenina from Brave New World, and Jill from Stranger in a Strange Land, and on, so that in a story like this, You expect to find a character like this. And to its credit, as you point out, the Elysium Enigma does try to invert the trope by having it turn out to be a performance. That she was deliberately trying to play the part of the fetching, innocent rebel girl, of the sort who would appeal to the protagonist in one of these dystopian stories. This is a side note, but for a lot of her dialogue, I couldn't tell what I was meant to make of it. She says things like, "No one from round here will help me, and I daren't be caught stealing." And there's a bit when she wants to have a look at an object you've just found, and she says, "Oh, do let me have a look." I couldn't tell whether this was just bad writing, or whether it was good writing meant to signal that she was laying it on too thick, or whether this was just the author being British.
Okay, well, I don't think it's option C. Um, I suppose, not being British, that I'm not the ultimate authority, but I feel like there's enough British people here that I can say fairly confidently that's not how anyone's spoken since maybe like the 19th century.
Very well. I have seen British people online complaining that the British dialogue that they hear in American movies and TV shows sounds like it's from the 1930s. But in any case, I suppose we can give the author some points for deliberately putting forward this behavior as a trope in order to invert it later. But he just ends up going to another trope. Instead of being the wide-eyed rebel ingenue who asks too many questions, Leela is what the game calls a cunning little vixen. And I'm not sure that stacking one well-worn flat character on top of another well-worn flat character actually gives us that much depth.
Can I just say, as an aside, you see all these stories about people who like come into contact with people from like another society, often a more enlightened society or something like that, where they're all just like very open-minded about sex, and they're just like, well, what do you mean you don't just have sex with whoever you like? I don't understand this idea of wearing clothes or covering up your natural body. I really wish just once we could see the opposite of that, where it's not the male protagonist going into a forest and like instantly surrounded by 5 nubile women, all of whom want to have sex with him simultaneously because, you know, that's like the obvious and natural thing to do in their better, like more enlightened society. I really just want to see a story about someone who encounters a more enlightened society that's absolutely horrified by the idea of sex or human contact, just because that would amuse me. You know, when they're like, you do what? Like you put your mouth on other people's mouths?
I guess we see something sort of like that in Herland by Charlotte Perkins Stetson Gilman in 1915. The male scientists go to an island inhabited entirely by women, but instead of being 80 blondes and brunettes all between the ages of 16 and 19 and a half, it's 3 million short-haired athletic women in sensible shoes, most of them middle-aged. And I think the main guy calls them epicene neuters even before he discovers that they reproduce through parthenogenesis.
Yeah, see, that sounds like my kind of novel. I just want to read about some very disappointed dudes.
And then the other one that springs to mind is Gulliver's Travels, in which the ideal society is presented as having been created by a bunch of extremely rationalistic horses who don't put much stock in emotion, let alone sexuality. But to return to the game, I remembered that you mentioned before the show that there was another thing that you wanted to say about Leela before we wrap up.
Oh, yes, that's right. So the conversations with Leela had me thinking that the story was a lot more interesting than it turned out to be, I suppose, because it was a little bit disappointing when I learned what the actual story was going to be. But for a while, before her little like innocent shtick got a little bit too obvious, I was absolutely convinced that there was something shady going on with the Elysian Society. So there's some backstory about the reason why the space empire doesn't interfere in the politics of Elysium, and it involved somebody dying. I think a woman died, and one of the space empire people also stuck his nose too far and got killed for it because some fighting broke out between the empire and the Elysians. So it's never really explained how this woman Natasha got murdered, but like her murder sort of sparked this whole conflict. But anyway, like because Leela spun this whole story that the elders were terrible people who just demanded absolute obedience and he couldn't choose who you're going to marry and blah, 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 blah. Like, I just decided that obviously she was probably killed by the council for some reason or other. And, in fact, it was probably some sort of ritual sacrifice. I don't know why I arrived at this conclusion, only that it seems like it would make a good story. And obviously, as you're experiencing a narrative, or at least when I'm experiencing a narrative, sometimes I like to enhance my experience by just coming up with the most wild-ass theories possible and seeing if they turn out to actually be correct.
Yeah, I've seen that fan theories about upcoming plot twists have become a big part of the modern experience of stories, which I guess is what happens when you add in the ability to have running conversations with other audience members all around the globe. It's a little foreign to me because I generally don't theorize about what'll happen in stories I'm following. I just let them play out. But I suppose that trying to piece together the clues yourself has been baked into at least the mystery genre from the beginning.
The name of the game is the Elysium Enigma, which sort of implies that there's an enigma and not just a spy hiding in the woods.
That's a good point. So my last point of discussion for this game is this. When I played Square Circle, lo these many years ago at this point, it struck me as a very anti-American game. And by anti-American, I don't even mean opposing the role that the US plays in the world today or during the Cold War. I'm talking about circa the War of Independence. Square Circle explicitly attacked the idea of starting a new government based on political principles and stressed the importance of sticking with tradition. That's a big reason I wanted to avoid Eric Eve games after that. Yes, Square Circle was bad as a story and as a game, but as a political document, it was abhorrent. So, I'm happy to say that the Elysium Enigma is better than Square Circle as a game. I can't say that I enjoyed it, but it's a respectable effort. But I was still struck by how pro-British and anti-American this game is as well. The author says flat out in the afterword that the idea here is that you have two opposing forces in this sector of the galaxy. There's the Empire, and then there's the Federation. And the author says, and this is a quote, although far from perfect, it, meaning the Empire, is basically a benign institution, whereas the Federation is evil. They're the villains. Now, I can see why someone might write an anti-American screed in 2006 after half a decade of neocon wars, but it can't be Bush and Cheney's attempt to build an empire that Eric Eve is objecting to because he's pro-empire. I objected to it. And if Bush and Cheney were bad, in most ways, Trump was an order of magnitude worse. And who knows what we'll get in 2024. I would absolutely be making backup plans to leave the country, except that it's almost impossible to do so without connections to the country you might like to emigrate to. And then, of course, there's the question of finding a country where I'd ever feel at home. Back in high school, I took a school trip to France and Britain, and I was shocked to discover that Britain felt much more foreign to me. I felt much more at home in France despite the language barrier. So, my question for you, as this show's resident Australian, is this. Australia is still part of the British Commonwealth. It has the Union Jack on its flag. I know that Australia has a lot of British expats, a much higher percentage than the US has. But would you say that Australia feels like it has more cultural affinity with Britain or with America? If I could move to Australia, would I feel at home, or would it feel very British to me?
Well, it's hard for me to say what very British would feel like for you. I think Australia is definitely influenced by Britain, but I don't think most Australians would really identify as particularly British, aside from, the people who are actually from Britain. The spelling's British, and Australia is technically a constitutional monarchy, but some recent polls have shown that slightly more Australians have stated that they would prefer to be a republic. But I suppose the population just doesn't feel strongly enough to really do much about it. I feel that as far as places that resemble Australia go, a lot of Australia feels a lot like California. It would definitely be more foreign feeling than Canada, which is essentially the same country. But I don't think Australia is particularly British. I have spoken with a number of South Africans who said that Perth feels a lot like South Africa in the 70s. I've never been to South Africa, but 1970s South Africa doesn't sound like a particularly British place. So I suppose there's that. I've also, I haven't spent great amounts of time over East, but I think the Australian capital cities are more interchangeable than the American capitals.
Yeah, as far as interchangeability goes, when I started getting interested in MasterChef Australia, I wound up going down a little bit of a linguistic rabbit hole. And I was surprised to read that apparently Australia doesn't even have regional differences in its accent. Class differences do affect the way people speak, but I'm told that what you hear as you go from Perth to Adelaide to Sydney to Brisbane is all pretty similar, while going from LA to New Orleans to Boston to Chicago is very much not. Does that reflect your experience?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think there's a bit of a vowel thing going on in Melbourne. I can't be any more specific than that. I think there is a bit of a documented vowel shift happening in Melbourne, but for the most part, no, there aren't really any regional accents. There is a city accent versus a country accent. It's not necessarily a class distinction. There is the broad Australian dialect and the less broad Australian accent. There does tend to be a bit of a distinction between urban regions and more rural regions.
So to wrap this up for real, it occurs to me that it also might be interesting to ask this question from the other direction. So, consider an Australian taking in some media from the US, like a movie or a TV show, versus taking in some media from the UK. Which is going to feel more foreign to an Australian audience?
That's a really interesting question. That's not something I've given a lot of thought to. I think for me, I have actually been to Britain and I do feel that it feels more foreign than Los Angeles, for example, where I've also been. But I feel like a lot of that is just like the architecture and the climate. In terms of culture, when I was in LA and I was riding from the subway, there were like these posters up with like pictures of children on them. And the posters said, "Love them, don't shoot them, please don't fire your gun into the air this New Year's." And that just like the number of assumptions that poster made, about the reader, that felt foreign. So I suppose what I'm saying is different things feel foreign. I think, I think on a superficial level, I would say that we resemble the US more. But then, the US doesn't have large swaths of British people living within it. So the influence of the constant stream of UK migrants isn't nothing. As for what feels more foreign on TV, part of the reason that's a hard question to answer is that I think I just accept that TV isn't going to resemble reality in general. You get very used to seeing an American version of reality on TV and you go, oh, well, you don't really think about it because that's just TV. If you went to an actual high school and everybody was a 30-year-old Californian, that would be weird. But on TV, it's not. That's normal.
And who knows, maybe it's being on the losing end of that kind of cultural imperialism that makes Eric Eve hate us so much. A quick postscript, Kat wanted to point out that she only worked in the mines for a few months and has spent most of her career in a normal hospital. So there you go. Our next game is Moonshaped by Jason Ermer, which came in 5th in the 2006 Interactive Fiction Competition. And I guess one way to catch up a bit might be not to cover the entire top 5 of the comp. But it was too late to take this one off the list because I already had a volunteer for it, and that volunteer is a new guest, also from the Commonwealth, also in the medical field, and that's Phoebe Ing. So, before we get to the game, I reckon that introductions are in order.
Well, my name's Phoebe. I live in Vancouver in BC, Canada, and I'm a practicing psychiatry resident. So that means I'm still training. I've finished medical school and now I'm in year 1 of 5 years of specialty training, possibly more years if I decide to subspecialize. So right now my day-to-day looks very different depending on what rotation I'm on. I'm still in the stage where they're trying to get us to learn and get a little taste of everything from the psychiatric emergency department to inpatient wards to kind of related specialties like neurology and family medicine so that we have a wider base of knowledge. And sometimes that can be very stressful switching jobs every month, but it's been fairly enjoyable most of the way through so far. So hopefully that will continue to be a good experience and I have not made a grave mistake.
So now that you've been doing these rotations for a little bit, has anything jumped out at you like, oh, maybe this is the thing I want to specialize in?
So far, I have found that I will most likely want to do outpatient psychiatry rather than in the hospital. I like having a bit more time to take with people. And sometimes in the hospital, the pressures of the number of patients and admissions and just like bed pressure, it can kind of put a sour note on things for me. And I feel like I'm not able to do as good of a job as I would like. So I think probably something more outpatient based or maybe something like child psychiatry where you're very much encouraged to take more and more time with patients. That's probably something a little bit more my speed, literally my speed.
All right, so as we move to the game, it's time for the big question. If you're young enough to have just finished medical school recently, that suggests that you probably weren't around back in the day when you'd encounter interactive fiction just by going to the mall and wandering into the B. Daltons and seeing all those gray Infocom boxes stacked up on the back shelves.
Yeah, no, that is correct. I do not have any memory of that sort.
So then how did you find out about IF?
Growing up, really liked video games and I really liked stories and reading and everything that had a narrative that I could follow. And one day it was in high school, I was at a LAN party. I don't know if that's a thing that the kids do anymore these days. But so we were all at a friend's house and we were all there basically with our computers playing video games in the same area, which was quite nice. And at one point, a friend brought me to his computer where he had an emulator and I think he had Zork on there. I ended up not liking that very much. It was a little too unforgiving. It was very frustrating. My narrative brain and my puzzle brain kind of didn't love that I was having to do so much puzzle to get to a narrative, but I've started to realize, okay, this is really interesting. And I used to really like choose your own adventure books. So I delved into it a bit more and I found myself really enjoying just being able to play games and read stories that were all very text-based. I liked the pace a little bit better than regular video games, I think, and I found that it really played into how much I liked reading as a kid. So that's where that started.
So it's very interesting to me to hear that we were well into the 21st century when you first encountered interactive fiction, and the game that introduced you to the art form was Zork from 1977. Because I imagine that's probably pretty typical, but it's sort of like if millennials and Zoomers were first getting into television by watching I Love Lucy or something. But in a way, I guess it's appropriate to discussing Moonshaped, because Moonshaped is based on stories dating back to the late medieval period, i.e. fairy tales. But I will let you fill in the listeners on the details.
So you were playing Little Red Riding Hood. You're setting off to bring your grandmother her weekly basket of food, and you find that she's gone. Once you get there, it's getting quite dark, so you're going to have to try to find her. And while finding her, entering into spoiler territory, you uncover that your grandmother is actually Gretel of Hansel and Gretel. And when she and Hansel escaped the witch, the dying witch cursed her family so that the men would become werewolves and the women would become werewolf curse carriers. And also nobody in the family could touch silver. Then finding your grandmother quickly turns into a quest to lift the curse.
Okay, so yeah. The chief gimmick of this game is weaving together a couple of different fairy tales so that Hansel and Gretel becomes the backstory of Little Red Riding Hood. And my first question is, does anyone care? I'm old enough that some of the first books that I read were collections of fairy tales that I found at my adoptive grandparents' house, and these were old. They may have been bought for my mother and my uncle, or they may have been books that my grandparents were actually given themselves back in the 1910s, back when fairy tales pretty much were the bulk of children's literature. But I don't really have any idea how much cultural currency fairy tales still have today, when a kid is more likely to be handed an iPad than a dusty leather-bound tome. So you're about a generation younger than I am, so what's your take?
I don't know if I'm the best person to ask this because I do actually remember getting these big books of fairy tales and reading those and kind of learning the fairy tales that way. And I remember when I was a little older, finding the original Grimm fairy tales and thinking it was super edgy for reading these like old, darker fairy tales. I do not think that any longer. But I definitely grew up with a lot more of these fairy tales. Maybe we need a Gen Z person to weigh in on this, but I don't know how much it resonates for them. But I feel like fairy tales are still very much within the canon of things that people reference. But I don't know. I personally do still remember fairy tales as like a thing from childhood, but I don't know how universal that is.
I guess to dig in slightly further on this topic, even if fairy tales are still familiar to upcoming generations, I wonder how much resonance they have or will have in the future. For instance, I grew up on Marvel Comics, and I totally imprinted on them. And so even though the product is not always the best, I've been following the Marvel Cinematic Universe because the MCU people are playing around with stories that mean something to me, even if the original stories aren't necessarily the best either. So, sure, I'm guessing that virtually everyone playing this game has heard of Little Red Riding Hood and has heard of Hansel and Gretel. But I wonder how many players were like, oh wow, my beloved cultural touchstones. And how many were like, okay, I understood that reference.
Yeah, I think I was definitely more towards the latter of like, I don't think I said like, oh wow. It was more like, oh, neat.
So to move from content to form, you said that you learned about IF by playing Zork, again, a game from 1977, at a LAN party. So here we are in 2006, and the mechanics of Moonshaped, they didn't seem to me to show that much development from what you're doing in Zork. Turn by turn, you're mainly going into a room, and you have to tediously search everything, and look under everything, and look inside everything, and move objects and hope other objects fall out, and basically collect as many objects as you can, some of which are literally keys for locks, some of which are figuratively keys for locks in that you use them to open up the next batch of story content. So my question is this fun?
I don't think I mind it quite as much as I feel like you're saying you do. I'm somebody who's fairly liberal with my use of hints. And so I think that maybe avoids a lot of the frustration of like, oh man, I need to go find a key and I have no idea where the key is. And I don't know, I guess I don't find it to be quite as dull of an experience. Just like when I go into it, I'm kind of expecting, okay, this is something where this sort of thing can happen, where I am looking around for hidden objects. And I'm not as miffed about that. Although there were a few things where I was like, oh, okay, I didn't realize that that was supposed to be interacted with in this manner. And that was a little like, oh, I feel like either that could have been made more obvious or it seemed a little bit arbitrary stuff. For example, if this was a detective story and I was like finding hints that and clues that made more sense rather than just these are the things that are in the way of the story moving forward. And this is like how we make this a game. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that pretty much sums up the issue that I have with this type of interactive fiction where your main task is finding hidden objects. It's an exercise in creating obstacles for the sake of creating obstacles. It's like, all right, you've got this idea for how to make Hansel and Gretel into the backstory of Little Red Riding Hood, but if you publish that as a blog post or something, no one's going to read it. So, okay, make it into a game, and you've got at least a small guaranteed audience. And as you say, hiding objects is how you make it into a game. But let me go back to something you mentioned a moment ago. You mentioned that when you did find the objects, they didn't work in ways that made sense to you. Do any specific examples spring to mind?
Oh, there was a couple. So there was one where you are supposed to get into the bucket that the well has, and you're supposed to essentially, I guess, you climb into the bucket and then like fall all the way down to the bottom. And that kind of uncovers a secret path to the cellar. It was just strange to me that the cellar needed to be locked in that way. Because for one, it took a lot for me to be like, oh, okay, when you say unusually big, you mean like big enough for a teenager. And that was not what I envision an unusually large well bucket to look like. I guess maybe I also don't have very much context about how big buckets are in wells, but it doesn't seem like, even if you say unusually big, that unless there was some other clue to it, I wouldn't have thought big enough for a person. And then there was also one point where you're trying to get candies out of a cage, and I was trying to get the player character to hit the candies with the walking stick and thought, okay, this obviously should work. And I kept going like, hit candies with a stick. And it kept telling me that violence was not the answer. And I was like, this feels like this shouldn't need to be a puzzle. Like if I was there as a person actually trying to do this, I shouldn't have to be like, oh, push it. It just feels like it was a little bit of an unnecessary puzzle there. But I just went into the hints and stuff. And I was like, oh, okay, you have to do push candies with like stick or wine bottle or whatever it was.
Yeah, good old guess the verb. I had the same issue when it came to the object hidden in the quilt. I figured there was something in there, and after a bad experience in the Elysium Enigma, when I got to Moon-Shaped, I figured, all right, I actually have to search the quilt. So I did that, and the game said I didn't find anything. But eventually I went to the hints, and the hint said, oh no, you have to move the quilt, and then the gloves just come tumbling out. And the thing is, if this were another type of game, like a conversation game, I might not expect object handling to be that robust, but it's not a conversation game. It's an object handling game. So that means you cannot have bugs like this game has. Like when you're in a field of flowers and you type take flower and the game says you can't see any such thing, and it turns out that the command you needed to type was take flowers, plural.
I don't think I ever took any of the flowers. I think a lot of this is like my narrative versus my puzzle. Because I was thinking, well, if I am actually lost, no matter how pretty the flowers are, I'm going to be trying to get unlost sooner rather than, I guess, picking flowers. So I don't think that even entered my mind.
Yeah, well, that's another thing. You're absolutely right that if these events were really happening, you wouldn't be grabbing everything you can carry along the way. But these sorts of text adventures train you not to picture yourself in the story, but to just mechanically try to get hold of every single object that's mentioned because you'll need it for a puzzle somewhere down the line.
Yeah, you just kind of become a pack rat.
And as for the bucket you mentioned, it hadn't occurred to me while I was playing the game, but yeah, if it really is that large, how... Well, wait a minute. Let me think about this. I was going to say, like, if you were to fill up a bucket that large with water, would you actually be strong enough to be able to haul it up? But now that I'm thinking about it, it wasn't really a well at all, right? It was a fake well that was actually just a secret passage to the cellar.
Yeah, and that feels like something that you should know as the granddaughter of this person, that like, oh, hey, grandma, are we going to get some water from the well? Actually, no, we can't. That's actually a secret entrance.
Yeah, and that brings me to another way that this game seems stuck in the past, which is that it's probably the 100th game I've played in which you're wandering around an abandoned landscape trying to piece together the backstory by getting info dumps about the past. In this case, those come in the form of visions that you get by opening a locket. But yeah, nothing is happening now. No one else is around. You're just wandering around finding out stuff that your grandmother could have just told you. So, what did you think of this format? Because I can tell you that in the mid-90s, people were crazy about it. A lot of the big awards went to games just like this. So, did it do anything for you? Did you enjoy collecting flashbacks?
I presume a lot of the games are this way because it's probably easier to code, like an abandoned setting in flashbacks, where the things are inherently already set in stone and there aren't as many branching things than just like a bustling city or something where there are NPCs and you have to keep track of them, and it's probably a bit more of a headache to do it that way. I feel like in terms of the story that it was telling, that this was still reasonably done. And the setting was atmospheric and like made sense and was reasonable in the context. So I don't think I minded it as much. And maybe this could also be a function of me not having played as much of the games that you've talked about. And I think at one point, one of my notes says, oh, Grandma is Gretel. Fun. I enjoyed it reasonably. I think if I wasn't in the mood for something kind of reflecting on the past, then it might not be quite as fun for me if I wanted to like interact with the people. I think every person that I tried to interact with, I couldn't go see my mom. And then the wolf interactions were very scripted. And then even if you do at the end rescue your grandmother, there's no interaction that you can really have with her. She's just said to be like too stunned to actually talk to her. So you can't really actually talk to anybody in the game. I think if I was in the mood for something a little bit more like character interaction driven, I would be potentially a bit more disappointed. But otherwise, I felt like the setting was really nice and atmospheric, and the fact that it was abandoned didn't deter me too much.
Well, you're definitely right that avoiding combinatorial explosion is a big part of the reason why this approach to IF became so popular with the authors. I actually once gave a talk about this at UC Santa Cruz. The problem is that combinatorial explosion is also where a lot of the fun is, at least for me. And so to me, the most interesting part of this game was the ending, when you can decide what combination of weapons to use and end up with 8 possible outcomes.
Oh, was there 8?
There were 8, yeah.
Oh, I don't think I got through all of them. Was it like a combination of who lives and then if you cut them with the dagger, that sort of thing?
That is correct, yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I don't think I got all of them, but I definitely did do the thing where I just kind of like went through and tried to figure out if there was a way I could save both of them. I think at one point I typed the command Heimlich Wolf. I don't think that worked, unfortunately. I do wish there was a way to save both of them, but
There is.
there is. Oh
Yes.
my goodness. How?
The idea is you use the hatchet, but not the dagger.
Oh, but then he dies like right away anyway, doesn't he?
As I recall, you chop the wolf open with the hatchet.
Yeah.
The grandmother gets out.
Yeah.
The wolf is not mortally wounded because it wasn't a silver hatchet.
Okay, yeah.
So the wolf is okay, the grandmother is safe, you sprinkle the bones, everybody lives.
I thought he died after that because once he turned back into a human, had a gigantic abdominal wound.
There's a version, if you hit him with the dagger as well, he will die.
Yeah.
But there is a clearly optimal ending that says something very close to, and you and your dad and your grandmother all lived happily ever after, and you knew that your own children would never become wolves, and everything is great, and yeah.
Hold on, I just pulled it up, and it hit wolf with the hatchet. Grandmother comes out. Wolf is in pain. Curse prohibits death. Wolf badly wounded. Sprinkle powder on bones. Oh, I guess it doesn't specifically say that he died. Oh, his body healed. Okay, I missed that the first time. Okay.
Uh-huh.
All right. Oh, okay. Well, that's nice. I just missed the part where his body was healed.
Yeah, that's part of the curse, is that if it's not silver, you can hack and slash him all you want, and he's not going to be killed or even permanently hurt. So as long as we're talking about wolves here, I see in my notes that you had a question about them?
Yeah, I just had one kind of little bugbear about the story. I think in general it was pretty nice, and all the scenes that did happen made sense and contributed to the story quite well. There was one that, and it's quite early on when you're walking with the wolf and he gets you lost. Was the wolf supposed to be her dad?
Oh.
I don't know who the wolf was supposed to be.
That hadn't even occurred to me. So yeah, for those who haven't played this, at the beginning of the game, there's a talking wolf who lures the main character off the path and gets her lost. And I was like, okay, it's Little Red Riding Hood, so sure, there's going to be a talking wolf. No problem there. And then toward the end, we learn about the curse that turns the men in the family into werewolves. And again, sure, this is the sort of genre in which it seems totally reasonable for werewolves to show up. But somehow it didn't click for me that those two types of wolves don't really go together. So I do not know the answer to your question.
I don't really know either. And then either way, I feel like there could be a potential issue with the narrative. On the one hand, if it's not the dad and that was just some random wolf, then there's a couple points to that. Like, one, why when the dad transforms, is he not able to become a sentient wolf that has ability to think and talk and walk along with a little girl in the forest and be completely fine and not put her in danger? And then on the other hand, if it is her dad and he is a wolf that like loses control, then it seems like a remarkably bad idea to both approach his daughter while in wolf form and then also lead her astray in the forest to the extent that she becomes completely lost on a route that she takes every single week.
What did you think of the player character, by the way?
I think one of the things that I did enjoy was that it was a specifically female player character. I think a lot of the time there's a lot of attempts to kind of make the player character perhaps a little bit more generic. And then the default then becomes not necessarily female. I do like that, this was a character with a specific identity and somewhat of a personality. Like she was a bit of an angsty teen. And like that, I think, came through in the story. And that was nice. I can't say that I see that too often. I think a lot of the time with interactive fiction, the idea is you want to be able to immerse yourself as you. And it was nice to have kind of a very specific picture of who that you was referring to.
Yeah, back in my IF writing days, I was one of the people trying to move these games away from the generic player character, the nameless adventurer, and toward playing specific people with defined personalities, like Tracy Valencia and Primo Vericella.
Yeah.
But let me ask you this. You said that you liked the fact that you're playing a female character, in this case, a teenage girl, or almost teenage. I think it says that she's about to hit her 13th birthday. Do you think that this affected the gameplay at all? Is it just a note for color? Or does your identity in any way define the things that you can and cannot do in the game?
I think it seemed a little bit more flavor than anything. There was no puzzle where it was, oh, this is at a height, or like you have to push this slab, and if you were an older, stronger person, then you would be able to do it. And because you were a young child who presumably doesn't have muscles and muscles and muscles for days, you cannot push the slab or whatever. There was nothing like that, and you have to find a clever solution for something there was like a limitation to who you were. But there was also not really, aside from your identity as a female member of this cursed family, there was nothing really specific to your identity as this preteen girl that if you were the brother instead, for example, you wouldn't have been able to do in the story if the story had been tweaked to be like, oh, the males are carriers instead of the other way around. So there wasn't really like anything distinctly preteen girl. I know you've brought up some of the Disney Marvel stuff previously, but like, for example, Turning Red could not have been a movie about a teenage boy or like a preteen boy. That was like a very specifically preteen girl experience and preteen girl movie and voice. And I didn't feel like it was like that in this game. It was more like, oh, this is a nice flavor kind of situation. There was nothing about the game specifically and the mechanics specifically. It was more about just, this is who the character happened to be. And it was just nice to see that the person that this story happened to be about was this female PC.
So that raises a second question. I see that the name of this author is Jason Ermer. So unless this is one of those Jennifer Jason Leigh situations, I'm going to assume that that's a guy. Now, as you just said, the player character being female isn't important to the gameplay. But still, any thoughts on how this author handled writing a female protagonist?
So you have two different types of stories, and one is they just happen to be a specific like minority or marginalized population, and the other is about the player character or the main character being that marginalized population. And I think if you're not a member of that population, then writing the second kind is a little bit strange and it seems a little presumptuous potentially, but anybody can write the first one where the person just happens to be a certain way, and that's completely fine. And I think we need both. You need both that the main character just happens to be female, and that is just who they happen to be. And you need also stories where the story works because they are female. And it's nice to see that, there's some representation of that first category here as well.
And that wraps it up for Ask Tell number 12. Thanks to my guests, Kat Zhang and Phoebe Ng, and to the authors of the games, Eric Eve and Jason Ermer. And thank you for listening. I hope it won't be another 5 years before episode number 13. But then again, if we're all still around in 5 years, that may be a win in and of itself. But bye for now.